Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And I would like to share with you some of my research and some of the agroecological theory behind the design of perennial polycultures for grain and forage. I think that the topic of this conference on polycultures and permaculture is extremely relevant, and it's extremely timely in terms of the need for adding more biodiversity and more perennials into agricultural systems globally. And I'm going to focus on this new emerging idea of developing perennial polycultures for grain and forage, which I think has and many other researchers and people think that it has the potential to really transform the agricultural systems, mainly in the areas that agriculture is more intensified in terms of inputs, like in the US and Europe and other regions where we grow cereals mainly. So the main points of the presentation, I want to start giving a little bit of background on why the importance of polycultures and some of the theory behind biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. Then focus on why perennials and perennial crops and what are the ecosystem services of perennials. And then introduce this novel idea of the perennial grains for dual use, growing perennial species for grain and forage production. And particularly, I want to share some brief results from research we're doing intercropping legumes and Kernza intermediate wheatgrass, which is one of the first perennial grains in the world. And try to draw some lessons for how can we design improve perennial polycultures and improve sustainable systems. So I want to start by this definition of ecological intensification. Agriculture has gone through, as the previous speaker was describing, an intensification in terms of inputs and high yields based on external inputs. And there's a lot of research and people promoting the idea of ecological intensification, that we need to redesign our agroecosystem by increasing biodiversity, both in time and in space, utilizing more ecological processes in order to achieve increased food production, but also increase production or provision of other ecosystem services like soil health and climate regulation and water quality, and greater resource use efficiency, reduced external inputs, and over time more stability and resilience in terms of the output, and therefore be more adapted to climate change. I'm originally from Uruguay, and the idea of biodiversity in agriculture production is very close to my home. This is a picture of native grasslands in Uruguay, where we grew a lot of different plant species that feed cattle in native grasslands. And if you look at that ecosystem, at that agroecosystem, it has the feature of having a lot of perennial species and a lot of species, so a lot of diversity and perenniality. And so when I think about ecological intensification of agroecosystems, I like to think in these two axes of increased biodiversity and increased perenniality or continuous soil cover, where native grasslands and many other ecosystems in the world, like diverse forests and other ecosystems, but I'm particularly more familiar with native grasslands, are the extreme example of high perenniality and high diversity. When you compare it with what most of the agriculture it's done in here, for instance, in the Corn Belt, we have annual monocultures, annual crops like maize or soybeans or wheat that are grown in a single species in the same place. And between those two extremes, there's a lot of other options. We could have perennial monocultures. If you think of an alfalfa or lucerne field where you have one perennial species growing and producing forage for other, or some of the biomass fields of switchgrass or other perennial grasses that are grown for bioenergy, are an example of high perenniality but low diversity. We can have annuals intercropped and mixes of annual crops. We can have annual crop rotations like a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, for instance, that increases biodiversity, but still without increasing perenniality. We can add cover crops and increase a little bit more the perenniality in the system. The crop forage longer rotation, where we have several years in a perennial phase of a grass or a grass legume mixture, and some years of crops. And then perennial polycultures, which are mixes of perennial species. We have perennial polycultures for forage, and we've been growing grasses and legumes together in perennial polycultures. But now we have the possibility of also growing perennial grains in polycultures. And so that's where I see the future of agriculture. I want to start by giving a little bit more background on the importance of biodiversity to ecosystem function. And the idea of ecosystem function means productivity, producing food, but also has to do with other functions like stability, like resistant to shocks or other potential ecosystem functions. And there's been a long debate over the history about what's the contribution of biodiversity or of more species to ecosystem functioning. Some people consider there was a linear increase, some others more like an asymptotic function, others that it was more an exponential, where you need a lot of species in order to get higher function, or others more idiosyncratic. It only depends on what species you're considering. And over time, and this is a topic I studied some time ago, about what was the history of this debate. In the 50s, 1950s, 1960s, famous ecologists like Odum, MacArthur, Elton started with this idea that diversity promotes stability, and that more diverse systems were more stable, which was later in the 70s and 80s contradicted by modeling studies from also famous ecologists like May and Pym, which produced modeling results that show that diverse systems were actually less stable than the more simple systems. And then in the 1990s, the first wave of biodiversity experiments started with the famous long-term experiments by Tillman in Minnesota and the European network of sites by Hector and colleagues, or Naim also. So there were big experiments that started to bring empirical evidence from experiments that biodiversity really increased productivity, that more diverse systems had higher productivity. And then a debate over the results and the interpretation of these experiments came in the late 1990s with a wave of criticism about the experimental design and the analysis, the statistical analysis of some of these experiments. The idea that they were obtaining those results because of sampling effect, like the idea that they were particular species that were selected in those experiments that were biasing the conclusions. And it was very interesting because in the late 1990s, 1999, there was like this huge, what was called a war among ecologists about the effects of ecosystem functioning on diversity and ecosystem functioning. And then there was a conference in Paris in the 2000s where they tried to come up together with a synthesis framework that I'm going to try to show in the next slide. And the second generation of biodiversity experiments came where all those more statistical issues and design of the experiments were solved. And more evidence started to be brought to the table, not only on productivity, but on other ecosystem functions. And in the late 2000s, a more like quantitative synthesis and meta-analysis started to show up, trying to condense all the experience of these last 20 years and expanding the results of the role of biodiversity in ecosystem functioning to other trophic levels, other functions, different scales, and the research continues now. But I want to like point that this idea that biodiversity increases or promotes ecosystem function was not, you know, so easy to come up to a consensus. I mean, there were experiments or observation studies like this one in this graph that show that more plant species in an ecosystem produce actually less biomass. And then there were experiments like the Tillman or Naim experiments that show that the communities with more species on average had higher productivity. And that's why there was all this discussion, okay, what's true, what's the deal here? And part of this had to do with the idea that historically ecologists have been thinking about diversity as an effect, as an effect of the productivity of a site. If you have soil, better soils and you know, more stable climate, you would get more diverse systems. If you were extremely bad soils or extremely rich soils, that would lead to lower diversity in an ecosystem. But when you switch those axes and then you put diversity in the x-axis as the driver variable and productivity or other ecosystem functions as the response variable, you can still have this same humpback curve, but when you can control the effect of the soil in an experiment or the effect of climate in an experiment, and you have in controlled conditions, you can see this effect that more diverse systems are actually more productive. And that was kind of what came about to be the consensus framework, trying to bring together all this evidence. I mentioned the sampling effect as this idea that, well, when you have more species, you're going to have in the mix, just if it's a random mix of species, you're going to have some species that are more productive than others. And so the sampling effect or selection effects goes to that idea that, well, as long as you have high productive species, you are going to have high productivity. But there's also this other hypothesis about complementarity, that the more species you have, the more productivity, not just because you have more productive species, but because species complement to each other or have some facilitative effect on each other. Like when you have a legume and a grass, that the legume can, you know, provide some nitrogen to the system and increase the availability of nitrogen in the system. So these two are not contradictory hypotheses, are complementary hypotheses that both explain why more diverse systems can be more productive or more stable. And one thing that I tried to do as part of previous research was trying to bring these ecological experiments and ecological theory into more managed agroecosystems, into agricultural systems. And there are some things that are hard to bridge here. And one is that in general, agroecosystems have higher soil fertility. They are comprised by, you know, not wild species, but cultivated species that have been selected and improved via plant breeding for many years. And so they are adapted to high fertility and high inputs environments. And we usually in agroecosystem, we have few species combinations, not like hundreds of species. And the choice of species is intentional. It's like farmers plant a certain species because they want to harvest that particular grain or fruit. So the idea of trying to bring concepts of like randomly assembled communities, it doesn't match very well with agroecosystems. And the other important thing is the statistical design, that in agriculture experiments, we usually have true replications where we have blocks and replications, and we can control the variability much better than in ecosystems. So agroecosystems can bring a lot more detail and power to this discussion of biodiversity and ecosystem function. And one experiment I did in Iowa, I looked at 52 different species combinations of 8 perennial species from grasses and legumes and a composite. And I have all the monocultures in those plots of the individual species, and then polycultures of 2, 3, 4, 6, and 8 species. And trying to have for each level of number of species, plots that had the legumes and the grasses and each individual species. So trying to isolate the effect of diversity and the effect of each individual species. We did this at 2 locations in Iowa, and we compared 2 different harvest regimes, one that we would cut 3 times, like in a forage management treatment, and one that we would let the plants grow until the end of the season and harvest total biomass at the end of the fall. We collected data over 3 years, and basically it was forage biomass the main variable here. And what we found was that in all the environments we looked, on average, productivity increased as the number of species increased. So we saw, just like many other experiments like Tillman and others, that the more diverse systems were more productive on average. But what was more interesting of this experiment is that we were able to identify, okay, which was the best monoculture, the highest yielding monoculture that in one environment was intermediate wheatgrass, another environment was alfalfa. And then when we separated which plots had that species, the monoculture that was more productive, we got this. So if you see, all the plots that had intermediate wheatgrass in this environment were high yielding, and all the plots that had alfalfa were high yielding, and there was not an effect of diversity on those plots. Okay, they were high yielding just because they had this more productive species. But then the other plots that did not have the most productive species, we saw that linear increase of productivity with richness. We also saw that wheat biomass was reduced with diversity, so we look at other ecosystem functions. But the main point here being that biodiversity increases ecosystem function, but individual species also have a very important role. So the choice of species is critical. We look at whether it was a selection or complementarity effect using a complex method of partitioning here. We found that the diversity effect was mainly explained by complementarity. That means that they were probably, facilitation of legume grass flow of nitrogen, or complementarity in the root morphology or cycles that made the positive effect of biodiversity. But the other important thing that we saw here, and when we look at more environments, it was that the best species really, or the most productive species really change over time. And so it's not enough to say, well, I'm going to plant, let's say, alfalfa or intermediate wheatgrass because it's very highly productive. But over time, because of differences in climate, and one year might be more dry and another year might be more wet or whatever, we found that the species here, that the best species here was intermediate wheatgrass, but then it was alfalfa, and then it was switchgrass. So we, by planting a polyculture, a combination of multiple species, we can actually be more secure in terms of yield over time. Whereas if we just plant one monoculture, we may have some years that yield is reduced. With all that information, we could develop models, and there's a lot of literature showing that you can model species interactions, and the results of the experiments pretty fit very well the models. And I'm not going to get into details, but we use a Locta Volterra species model where we modeled the interaction between the species. And we were actually able to predict the behavior of the more complex mixtures using the information from the experiment. So I think there's a lot of potential, and I know there's a lot of interest in this conference about this, of using modeling to really design better polycultures and predict the behavior of better polycultures. So trying to sum up this part of the talk, I think more diverse communities on average are more productive and have better ecosystem function. But we have to realize the importance of these individual driver species, that individual species play a major role in productivity, and therefore the design and the breeding of those species, it's very relevant. And then as more functions are considered, when we care not only for productivity, but also for soil conservation and water quality and stability and resilience to a climatic extreme or whatever, as we increase more functions, there's research also showing that we need more species in the ecosystem. And then that over time, these driver species may change. And we can use models to predict the performance of polyculture. So all this can be used to the agroecological design of perennial polycultures. Now, I want to go back to this original framework, and I think I provide enough evidence that we need biodiversity in the ecosystems, in the agroecosystems. But also, I want to strengthen now the importance of perenniality and having more perennials and more continuous cover in the agroecosystems in order to be more sustainable. And perennials, they provide a lot of ecosystem services. This is a picture of a forage field where we have perennial grasses and legumes growing. And this is a picture here of the root system of perennial species, intermediate wheatgrass, that I'll be spending a lot of time talking now. And both the perennial cover, the continuous cover of the soil, and the deep root system of the perennial species provides erosion control, so we can keep the soil in place and it doesn't get eroded or washed with water and rain and wind. But also nutrient leaching reduction, because those roots are absorbing the nutrients from the soil year-round. And therefore there's no nitrogen or other nutrients that are leaching towards the groundwater or towards the rivers. And so we provide better water quality. And also carbon fixation, because all those roots and all that canopy that's photosynthesizing year-round is fixing carbon and therefore mitigating climate change. There's many other ecosystem services that we could get there, but I want to highlight those three. And perennials, we have them, and we've been using them forever as pastures for grazing livestock, or forages for harvesting hay for feed. Recently, biomass systems for using for bioenergy. But what I want to focus today is on this new potential of producing grain out of perennial crops. And this idea was introduced by Wes Jackson at the Land Institute, and the Land Institute in Kansas has been developing this research for more than 30 years now. And today we have actually perennial grains in the ground grown by farmers in the US and abroad that are really what I consider the most radical transformation of agriculture. There's been recently a lot of media attention to Kernza, what is an intermediate wheatgrass, and it's the grain of this perennial grass that is somewhat similar to wheat, and it's kind of intermediate between wheat and a grass. And it has all these potential ecosystem services of fixing carbon and reducing climate change, but at the same time producing grain and for human consumption. So this is a picture of intermediate wheatgrass root system over time in fall, winter, spring, and summer compared to the root system of annual wheat. And as you can see, the dense and deep root system of this grass is really impressive. Intermediate wheatgrass has been used for the grain that we harvest from this grass has been used to produce beer. Patagonia Provisions was the first company that produced beer out of this, out of Kernza. But there's also other local breweries across the United States that are producing Kernza beer. General Mills, which is a major food supplier of cereals, now has also committed to introduce Kernza cereal And you can use Kernza for flour, for pasta, for pancakes, for many different things. So the markets for Kernza are developing and are growing, and there's a lot of interest among consumers for trying this new perennial crop, and that has the potential to be more sustainable. We've interviewed farmers and asked them, farmers who are growing Kernza across the United States, and asked them why they are doing it and what are their main questions. And the main thing, they are all motivated by trying something different, by innovation, by a sense of environmental consciousness, but also the importance of they have a lot of questions about how can we manage this new crop. This is a crop that was basically released to commercially releasing as 5 years ago. And there's a lot of research that needs to be done in order to optimize the management of this crop. But the main point that we think makes this perennial grain feasible right now is that we can use it in dual use management, what we call to harvest grain and harvest forage. And in this schematic, if you think, you can harvest forage in the spring, whether grazing or haying. You can let the grain grow over the summer, and at the end of the summer you harvest the grain with a combine, and then you harvest the forage biomass that's left, and then after it regrows in the fall you can harvest more forage again, and the cycle goes on and on year after year, because this is a perennial. So this idea that we can both harvest grain and forage out of the same perennial crop, it's what makes Kernza today feasible. In terms of yields, and my apologies, this slide is in pounds and acres. But the yields are still, the grain yields are still low compared to wheat or other grains. It's like a third or a quarter of the yield of annual wheat. And also we've seen that some of those, that grain yield declines over time, but the forage production does not. Forage production is really high, between 5 and 10 tons every year, we've seen here in Wisconsin. And so, so it does, that's why the forage is very important. And when you consider the prices that today or last year they were paying for Kernza grain, is really an attractive option for innovative farmers. These are some pictures of the management. We planted it in August, September, in the fall. Then in the spring you have a nice canopy that you can graze or harvest for forage. Then you let it go, and you get a very high, tall crop that you can, at the end of the summer, harvest with a combine or swath it. And then you can, again, in the fall, harvest forage or graze it. And so we've looked at what's the forage grain yields and the forage quality. It's quite good forage quality in the spring and in the fall. In the summer, it's much lower forage quality, but still, it's possible to feed it to cattle, maybe in a mixed ratio. We've had some studies looking at the performance of beef cows fed with Kernza forage, summer Kernza crop residue, and the cows got weight, and they were actually after calving, we didn't see any difference between the cattle that was fed 50% Kernza, 50% hay from alfalfa, where with the control treatment. So this is really a forage that can be utilized. And the most interesting thing is that grazing, we had a study here where we look at the spring and fall grazing timing, and grazing did not affect grain yield. So it actually doesn't reduce the grain yield of Kernza to graze it in the spring or in the fall. And therefore, and actually one thing that we also saw is that grazing may actually reduce lodging, so that it's beneficial to use this perennial grain crop for forage too. Another benefit of these intermediate wheatgrass systems is weed suppression. And we've followed wheat communities over 3 years in an established intermediate wheatgrass field. And the first year there was a lot of annual weeds, shepherd's purse and pennycress and other summer annuals. But then in the second and third years, once the intermediate wheatgrass was established, we just saw a little bit of perennial weeds like dandelion, and really wheat biomass was reduced over time significantly. So having this perennial crop, it was a good way to suppress weeds in these fields. But the main point is not to grow a perennial grain only. We want to grow them in polycultures. There's, as I explained in the first half of my talk, there's a lot of benefits of diversity, and there's a lot of need for increasing diversity. And then the big question is, how do we grow these perennial crops in polycultures? And so we have lots of agronomic management questions, because let's say we want to grow Kernza in a polyculture, which other species are we going to grow it with? And not only which species, but which genotypes or cultivars are we going to use? At which density and which spatial configuration, which management, when are we going to plant it? How are we going to harvest it? So there's a lot of questions about management that we need to think about when we're trying to design these perennial polycultures. And we have a long-term experiment here. We're looking at different legumes intercrop with Kernza, and we've seen a lot of, of course, benefits of having the legumes in the system. This is a study that has been established in 2 locations in Wisconsin. We look at 2 different row spacings and 10 different combinations of systems where we have intermediate wheatgrass monocultures that we hand weed, or that we let them grow with the natural abundance of weeds, different nitrogen levels, and then different legumes, alfalfa, red clover, cura clover, berseem clover, and even soybeans. And we've been following over 3 years now the grain production of Kernza and the forage production of all these mixed. These are some pictures of the Kernza interseeded with the red clover, Kernza with the cura clover, Kernza with alfalfa, and really, I mean, we still don't have the final results, and I don't know how much you can see this slide, but what we found is that the grain yield of Kernza is reduced in the presence of the legumes. So there is a trade-off here when the grain yield is significantly reduced in both locations when we add the legume. But of course, there's a harvest of legume biomass that, of course, we have when we have the polyculture, and we don't have when we have the monoculture. And then also the legumes have a role in reducing wheat biomass too. And the total forage biomass, when you add the Kernza biomass and the perennial legume biomass, it's higher. So we have some trade-offs in the use of legumes in an intercropping system with Kernza. We're also trying to figure out which are which particular, not only which species, but which particular cultivar or variety. In this case, we're comparing alfalfa varieties, and we've seen different differences in the Kernza yield with different alfalfa varieties. There are some that are taller, there are some that are more that grow shorter, and that has an effect. And this is a project where we have in collaboration with the Land Institute too, Brandon Schlotman, and also private companies and the University of Minnesota. And so there's, again, the point here is we can find and optimize the system by looking at all these different features. And another thing that we're looking is at the interaction with the management, in this case with planting date. If we plant later, we have lower yields, but there's an interaction between the planting date and the intercropping. In this case, the red line is when we plant the red clover in the spring, the next spring. So we plant the Kernza in the fall, and then in the next spring we plant the legume. And the blue line there is when we have at the same time planting Kernza and red clover in the fall. And so, as you can see in that slide, we get better yields by planting the red clover in the fall. Sorry, in the spring, the next spring. So we give the Kernza a little bit of time to establish before the legume comes. What lessons can we draw from this? Well, when we start adding up planting density, row spacing, configuration of the species, what varieties, what planting dates, all those things will interact in the design and in the performance of a polyculture. And so the agronomic management questions for designing optimal perennial polycultures mixtures grows exponentially. Imagine designing an experiment where you need 2 or 3 planting dates and 5 or 6 species, and each species with 5 or 6 cultivars, and then so it's really growing exponentially. And the other important thing is that we have seen some trade-offs between grain yield and biomass yield and other services like weed suppression that we have to account for. So I guess the main point is more research is really needed to address these questions in order to be able to design these perennial polycultures. So I wanna close by coming back to this idea that we need more perenniality and we need more diversity in our systems, and perennial polycultures are the closest to the native ecosystem that we can get in terms of diversity and perenniality, and more research is needed really to optimize how we manage this really promising alternatives. So with that, I would like to thank all my crew and lots of students and technicians and people, and also the funding of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Land Institute, SARE, North Central SARE, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, Green Lands Blue Water, and many other partners. We do a lot of this research in collaboration with farmers and across Wisconsin, and we're very grateful for that too. And I'd be happy to take questions on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very great presentation and quite hot and actual topic about perennial grains. So right now I would like to use this opportunity and pass you the question from our Ukrainian researcher who is trying to introduce Kernza in Ukraine. So she's asking for how many years it is feasible to grow Kernza on the field, and which legumes you combine with Kernza in your experiment.
Yeah, so thank you. So intermediate wheatgrass as a species can live forever. Really, we've seen stands of intermediate wheatgrass of 10 years, 20 years, and they produce forage for a very long time. The grain production of Kernza really, it goes down in the 3rd year, and we've seen that decline, and we're trying to do research to figure out how to avoid that yield decline. So if you're thinking in harvesting the grain, probably 3 years is what so far we think that we can use it, but then you can continue using the crop only for forage. We think that there's some management practices that we can do to reduce that yield decline, and that might have to do with some soil disturbance, some cultivation, or even using fire. And we have an experiment that we started that we're looking at into that, because in other crops, other seed producing crops, perennial seed producing forages, farmers are able to maintain that grain production or seed production. So we still need to figure out exactly how to do this. I don't know if there was a second part of the question I forgot.
Legumes you used in your experiments?
Which legumes? So we had alfalfa, Medicago sativa, or lucerne in Europe. We use red clover, the Trifolium pratensis. We use Cura clover, Trifolium ambiguum. Cura clover is very competitive, and after establishment, it kind of wiped out the grass in our conditions here. We looked also at some annual legumes like persimmon clover, and in the case of the annual legumes, Kernza was much more competitive, and so over time they kind of disappeared.
Thank you, Valentin. So now I give the floor to in-person presenters. Anyone have questions?
Yeah, I've got one.
Yes, please.
When you're talking about intermixing soybeans or these other legumes with the Kernza, and you noted the drop in yield, I'm wondering how comparable that legume made up economically. So would you be able to obtain the same amount of profit off that same plot of land if you intermixed with alfalfa or soy or clover?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I said, there's a trade-off between the grain production and the forage production, but definitely having the legume provides a much higher forage yield and higher forage quality, right? And so if you are either grazing your own cattle or you are selling hay out of your system, you will get much more economic income out of the forage. And so I don't have the actual numbers to for this particular system, but I think it would still be profitable, even if you get like a reduction in maybe 10–20% of the Kernza grain. You're going to get a much higher increase in the forage, and I think economically that would make the system work better. I mean, come out better in terms of profitability, but I haven't run those numbers.
So now I will forward the questions. The three questions I combined in one from online presenter. It's about other component livestock. So like what defines the diversity of livestock in your experiment? So it looks like it was fenced, so it was just one type. And then what was fed to this livestock in the period where they were excluded from Kernza field, and how you managed the issue with leaching nutrients from cattle manure?
Yeah, so I agree that it was a monoculture of grazers, and we just had one species of cattle growing and grazing, and actually in our experiment it was we just bring the cattle to do one grazing in the spring, like a mob grazing, and then remove it. So the cattle is not in the system for long, more than 1 or 2 days. And the same we did in the fall. In the fall, we come with the cattle, we graze it and then remove it for the plot. So it's just a quick grazing and not a continuous grazing. We haven't tried other species of cattle in our studies. I know there's some group in Australia looking at intermediate wheatgrass and also perennial wheat, and they are grazing with sheep. Yeah, I mean, like those are, as I said, there's exponential number of questions on how to optimize this system. Yes, if you come with diversity of grazers, that's another important question, but we haven't looked at that. I know if that answers the.
Thank you. So basically now we have time maybe for 1 or 2 more questions. So yes.
Can you talk about any research you know about into other types of forbs that would relate to modeling a native prairie, like sunflower or other species that I know that I've heard about from the Land Institute?
Sure. So I focus mainly on Kernza, but really the idea of developing perennial grain crops and oilseed crops has gone really far, and the Land Institute has a lot of species that are researching. As you mentioned, there's perennial sunflower. There's a program on Silphium, which is a perennial sunflower that it's being domesticated. There's also perennial sorghum that is also a cross between the annual sorghum and Johnson grass, and they are they already introduced that new crop and they're testing it in Africa, and it's really promising. There's perennial rice. Perennial rice, it's already a really commercial crop in China that the Land Institute is collaborating with the researchers from Hunan in China, and they have sites all over Southeast Asia looking at perennial rice that can regrow and produce several harvests within a year. And then there's perennial legumes that are being researched. Alfalfa is one of them, and there's other lupins that are candidates for being perennial grain legumes. So yeah, in the long term, we foresee that there would be much more perennial grains in polycultures also, and Kernza and perennial rice are the ones that are right now leading the expansion because they are more in a commercial phase, but there's many more coming in the pipeline.
Thank you, Valentin. So I think that it's the time for the last question, because I believe that you, if you like...
Sorry, I should have said pigeon pea too. Sig snap is mentioned in this. Pigeon pea is another very important perennial grain legume that it's been researched, and it's grown in Africa a lot. And I think Sig snap is later in this afternoon. She's going to be talking more about that. So we're looking forward to that. Sorry, Sig.
So I'm not passing you the question from online presenters, because I think that you can communicate with them in chat during the break. But the last question from in person.
Are they, they're not genetically engineered, these are hybrids? Okay.
So they're not genetically engineered. Some, in the case of Kernza, it's not a hybrid. It's just a domesticated grass. So it's the perennial grass that have been saving the best seeds year after year. There's not even a crossing with another species. In the case of perennial wheat, for instance, yes, that's a hybrid between annual wheat and intermediate wheatgrass. I didn't talk about perennial wheat, but that's a hybrid. In the case of perennial sorghum, it's a hybrid. But in none of these cases, there's any genetic engineering involved.
The root length was not changing in your graph. Does it change in reality? The root length through the year?
Well, yeah, it was just a diagram. Yeah, we imagine that there will be changes over time, and particularly at the times that you harvest, you would expect that some of that root biomass would die and mineralize, and so there will be fluctuations. I agree that diagram is not the best way of showing it. Yeah.
I see that there is a lot of interest about your presentation, and still a lot of questions are popping out. So I would like to ask, will you be able to join the discussion session today?
Yes, later this afternoon.
That we will, because we have two slots, that we will just include your presentation, the discussion about this topic in the discussion session, and then we can elaborate it more. And so far, I would like to thank you very much for your very, very inspiring presentation. Thank you.